In 2019, Yoshitomo Nara's painting, Knife Behind Back, was sold for over $26 million, establishing him as the most expensive Japanese artist of all time. Born in 1959, Nara rose to fame in the 1990s with his seemingly simple yet emotionally complex manga-inspired characters, often glaring back at the viewer with sadness, anger, sometimes just a vague, indiscernible, yet somehow instantly relatable expression. His career has spanned many decades, if not a lifetime, of drawings, paintings and sculpture work, with many of his paintings selling for millions of dollars, bridging the gap between fine art and pop culture, and garnering a significant cult following. But as always with my videos, we're going to take a step away from the finished work hanging up in the gallery, and delve into Nara's studio spaces, and the rooms, the setup, the equipment that have fueled the imagination of Japan's most expensive artist. At 64 years old, Yoshitomo Nara has lived in many places, and he's worked in a variety of studio spaces around the world. Between 1988 and 1993, when Nara was around 30 years old, he lived in Cologne, Germany, whilst completing an apprenticeship. And then after graduating, he stayed in Germany and set up a studio and did some teaching. And we're actually quite lucky to have a fairly long video, and maybe the only video, of Nara in Germany in 1999, and I'll post a link down below if you want to check it out for yourself. We're going to focus more on his later studios in this video, but unsurprisingly they're all set up in very similar ways. Generally speaking, it's a fairly simple, white-walled, sparsely furnished square room with the painting area in one half and then a desk and storage area in the other. And you might also have noticed his brushes and paints spread out across the floor, which on the surface seems quite chaotic and messy, but it's actually Nara's way of maintaining control and focus, and it allows him to act in a very kind of quick and spontaneous manner. We'll come back to this idea later in the video. Nara's close and important relationship with music is quite evident in this video as well, and he has his famously loud rock music playing in the background with his quite extensive CD collection you can see here, another really important part of his process. So again, I don't want to go into too much detail about this space in particular. There's a lot of interesting things to point out, but as we go forward, you'll notice that we'll revisit a lot of these interesting details in his more recent studio spaces. So Nara ended up returning to Japan in the year 2000 after his studio in Germany was actually scheduled for demolition. And it's at this point that we very fortunately have an abundance of studio space footage thanks to the amazing 2007 documentary Travelling with Yoshitomo Nara. And again, I'll post a link down below to the full documentary. Nara was quite a well-established artist at this time, and so in addition to the documentary, there was even an entire book titled Birth and Present, a studio portrait of Yoshitomo Nara, where photographer Mie Morimoto documented Nara's lifestyle over around a 6-month period in his Tokyo studio. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the book, I didn't go out and buy it, so we only have a few snippets which I've probably shared throughout the video so far, but I did think it was an interesting illustration of Nara's popularity within the art world at the time. Living and working from his 2-story warehouse space for around 5 years, Nara's studio is a great example of an artist who works best in a more messy, slightly disorganised, maybe even chaotic studio environment, sometimes even with cigarette butts lining the floor after a long, deep painting session. And it's something that definitely sits in contrast to the hyper-organisation and cleanliness of Takashi Murakami, for example, a long-time friend of Nara's. And as you can see, the studio itself is very bare bones, really just a simple warehouse building with thin metal exterior walls. Even though the place was cold in the winter and hot in the summer, it was quite an effective studio as the building itself was actually very tall and fairly large. And so despite the simplicity of the building itself, it actually meant the interior was an ideal studio space for Nara's style of working, having high ceilings and an open floor plan. Going inside, the ground floor was the primary painting space, as you can see, with a sort of makeshift desk office area, and then an old wooden ladder leading up to Nara's living space on the first floor of the building, which is equally bare bones and pretty empty. The ground floor has these white walls set up, which may have just been there as part of the building's construction, or potentially set up by Nara, I'm not entirely sure. You've probably seen this in many other art studios and galleries, but of course white walls act as a sort of non-distracting blank canvas that doesn't affect the perception of colour within the artwork, so it is quite an important aspect of really any studio. However, saying that, what's quite unique and characteristic about all of Nara's studios are the collection of random toys and items scattered around the room, and then lots of small notes and posters covering many of the walls. Nara says that my studio walls are covered with posters of my heroes, the Ramones, Bob Dylan, Kurt Cobain. Since childhood, Nara has surrounded himself with cheap toys and dolls, culled from flea markets and garbage dumps. I came to empathise with them, to imagine narratives for them, he says. So it's an interesting quirk of Nara to embellish his studio like this. It's definitely not something that we see too often in other creative studios. And I think it's fair to say that these somewhat cluttered and insignificant personal touches to his studio really play quite an important role in the production of his work. And ultimately, I'm sure many of these plastic, wide-eyed Disney toys sitting around on the shelves heavily influence some of the most expensive art ever sold in Japan. The Travelling with Yoshitomo Nara documentary concludes with Nara leaving his Tokyo studio in 2005 and moving out to the countryside, where I believe he still resides to this day. There's actually a few shots of his studio completely empty, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to see. But his current studio space is certainly an upgrade from the Tokyo space, being much larger and a more modern building. He also has this separate dedicated music and reading room, which features quite heavily on his Facebook page. But whilst his current studio is much more fitting for his standing in the art world, you can probably notice that it's really quite the same as his previous spaces, something I mentioned when we were looking at the studio in Germany. The white walls, a makeshift desk space in one half, the painting areas in the other half, collections of toys and posters scattered around the studio. We can also see an armchair positioned in the centre of the room facing his paintings, and this is an important addition to an artist's studio as, aside from having a comfortable place to sit, it also allows Nara to observe his work without being involved in the process of creating it. So a lot of the time Nara, and really any artist, needs to take a step back from the work and essentially just stare at it, sometimes just for a few seconds, sometimes for much longer, and let the work speak for itself, to breathe almost, in order for Nara to properly figure out how to move forward with that particular piece. One thing that really stood out to me about Nara Studios is how he organises his equipment. So Nara definitely has a number of dedicated storage spaces, drawers, a few buckets of brushes and so forth, but more often than not his actively used materials and equipment are spread out across the floor, particularly in the main painting area like you can see here. And as we've discussed, it looks messy and disorganised, but it's actually removing friction or resistance and allowing him to be extremely spontaneous and adaptive to where the painting wants to go. He also consistently works alone without any assistance, and so he doesn't really need to worry about careful organisation and equipment management. There's only one person using the tools and materials, and so it only needs to serve him and his way of thinking and moving around the studio. The other small but obviously very important detail is Nara's paint palette, which looks like it's just a large piece of wood or plastic, I can't quite tell, but as you can see it's often positioned right under the canvas to minimise the amount of movement required to pick up more paint, which seems like a trivial thing to point out, but when you're actually working for hours and hours at a time, the position of your palette really becomes quite a significant detail, so Nara's definitely thinking about that at least to some degree. And what's interesting is that a lot of artists will actually use a glass palette because it's very easy to mix the paint on a very flat surface and then clean it off at the end of the work session. But as you can see, Nara doesn't clean the palette at all. So he has these big build-ups of paint that have accumulated over the months and potentially years of use. And the simple reason for this is that he mostly uses acrylic paints, which of course dry very, very quickly. And because he has a very spontaneous, in-the-moment way of working, he doesn't have all of his colours pre-mixed and pre-potted, which of course would normally prevent acrylics from drying out. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there is a lot to be said about Nara's actual painting process. The main thing that really stood out to me is how he almost discovers his images directly on the canvas in the moment. And of course every artist does this to some degree, but Nara's process is entirely made up of this form of discovery. So some artists will have this initial exploratory stage, but will then refine those ideas and maybe colorise them in the computer before transferring them onto a canvas. But Nara doesn't really do any of that, it's just straight onto the canvas without much thought or any preliminary sketching at all. And this means that his art is free to breathe, to change and evolve by itself, with Nara just being there to respond very quickly and instinctively based on how he feels about the current stage of the painting. And there's a fantastic video on YouTube, which I'll link below, that visualises this process perfectly. And apologies for the poor quality, but I felt it was just too good not to at least briefly show a few of these images. And you can see here that sometimes he just throws a bunch of colour onto the canvas, playing with the colours, almost waiting for the image to appear from the other side, as the video's translation says. And then talking about a different piece, he goes on to show how he initially disliked a composition, so he quickly painted over it, and then he tried a different idea, and then tried another idea on top of that, all happening very quickly and in the moment. And so the reason I wanted to talk about his process briefly was because his studio setup facilitates this method of spontaneous exploration and discovery. His workspace is open plan and designed for movement, allowing him to step back and observe, let the work breathe by itself. Of course, his work is very large as well, so he needs quite a large space to accommodate those canvases. He also works alone, as we've discussed, and so no one else is going to disturb his creative flow state or pack away his materials. His brushes and paints and other tools are spread out across the floor, always ready to be picked up and used at a moment's notice. And so this all collectively fosters this kind of artistic improvisation that I think is so evident in Nara's work. So that just about ends the video. I just want to say that this artist was recommended to me by someone in the comments, so firstly thank you to that person. And if you guys know anyone that I should check out, possibly do a studio review for, let me know in the comments. I do read every single comment, so let me know your thoughts. Hopefully you found something interesting or enjoyable. If you want to see more of this kind of content, definitely hit the like button, it really goes a long way, and subscribe because I've got a lot of really cool videos planned for the future. But until then, thanks for watching.